Wow. Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to this VVD International webcast. Thank you so much for joining us. And I can say for this webcast, good afternoon, everyone from Europe, but also good morning to our guests who are joining us from the United States of America. Because today we are discussing the issue of American affairs in this VVD International webcast with all our international friends. A warm welcome.
CNN projects Joseph R. Biden Jr. is elected the 46th president of the United States, winning the White House and denying President Trump a second term.
I have been very, very direct with Secretary Stoltenberg and members of the alliance in saying that NATO members must finally contribute their fair share and meet their financial obligations. And if we do work it out, that'll be positive. And if we don't, it'll be positive also, because
no,
we'll just think about those cars that pour in here and we'll do something, right?
We have to work.
But it'll be positive. But again, Mr. Prime Minister.
Thanks again for joining us on this VVD International webcast. Today we're going to discuss American policies in this webcast. But let me first start by introducing 2020. 2020 was, maybe for all of us who's watching, the most unusual year you've ever been through. At the beginning of the year, we all had our plans for the start of the year. We all had our dreams at the beginning of the year. And we all had our New Year resolutions. But yet eventually we had to change our plans because of the COVID crisis. That was also the case for VVD International. We had our plans to meet you, all our partner parties, in real life again and travel around the globe. We had the ambition to visit you in the different countries and learn from each other. We wanted to meet again with all the congresses, with the ally congresses, and with the Renew Europe movements. And of course to invite you to the Netherlands and to see you all here. But unfortunately, that is not possible due to all the COVID measures. But I'm so thrilled and happy to welcome you and end this year as VVD International with our VVD International webcast. This week we have 3 webcasts on what happened this year internationally. And the first 2 have been presented by my liberal friend Ruben Brekelmans on Belarus and Lebanon. And today we're going to discuss the issue of American affairs, where we see some big changes, of course, in 2020. What we are going to do today is we're going to discuss 3 different topics related to American policies. And we do that with 4 amazing guests. And before, I will of course introduce them, but before I do that, I would like to ask you to join us. You can ask your questions on Twitter, you can ask your questions on Facebook, and you can ask your questions on Instagram. And I will have them here in front of me on my iPad, and I can read them and of course join them and ask your questions to the great panel that we have. Please let me introduce to you our great panel. The first person that I can introduce to you is joining us live from The Hague, from the Embassy of the United States. And I see that we're going there. A very warm welcome, of course, Mr. Ambassador. It's an honor to have you here. You served your country as a member of House of Representatives from Michigan for 18 years. You're the ambassador now of the United States in the Netherlands for 4 years. So thank you so much for joining us. I think you're a very famous person in the Netherlands because you're very active, of course, in defending US policies or explaining what's going on in the United States. But you also have your roots in the Netherlands, and you're also known for enjoying the Dutch habits, such as eating Dutch cheese. Bitterballen are very something that are appealing to you. And also, of course, herring is something that I've seen you eating. So my first question to you would be, if you would ever... No herring? Okay, no herring again anymore. But if you would ever leave the Netherlands, what would you miss the most? Definitely not the herring.
Not the herring. If I love the people. I mean, I just met with Kees van Rooij, one of your burgemeesters, in the 3 years that Diane and I have been here. We have met just an awesome number of Dutch individuals from around the country. This is a country that is full of wonderful people. Diane and I will miss. We will miss the people. I will miss the bike paths. I will miss the roads. You have no potholes. You have a wonderful infrastructure system, but no, we will miss the people.
And as you say, you are going to miss the Netherlands and the people. Did you already make plans to go back to the Netherlands, or are you willing and able to serve as ambassador under President-elect Joe Biden?
I think, I was here. I served at the pleasure of President Donald Trump. His administration picked me to be the ambassador here. America is now moving on. We are moving to a new administration. It is expected that I will resign. I have resigned. I will be leaving this post effective January 20, and Joe Biden will appoint someone to represent his administration. I wish that person the best. He or she is going to be coming into a great job in a great country.
Thank you. And thank you so much for being here just before you're leaving the Netherlands and explaining what's going on in the United States. Please let me move on. We're now introducing the second speaker of our panel. It is also a big honor. He's joining us live from the United States of America. It is Stephen Szabo. As you can see, he's in Washington, D.C. A big honor that you are here. Senior fellow at the American Institute of Contemporary Studies. I see the connection is working. You are aligned to the German Marshall Fund. You are an expert when it comes to transatlantic relations between Europe and the United States. And as I can find, you're a big defender of a bigger role of Europe and especially Germany on the world stage, not because of Donald Trump, but because it's in our own national interest, of course. You're actually the only person in the panel that lives in the United States currently at the moment. Thank you so much for joining us. And I say to you, good morning. To the rest of the panel guests, I can say good afternoon, of course. Thank you very much for joining. Maybe my first question to you, when we look at the news here in the Netherlands, it looks like everything changed in the United States since there have been elections. If you walk around the street in the United States, is it really that different? Did things already change in the United States?
Well, thank you for having me. I wish I was there with you in the Netherlands, perhaps next year. I wish I could walk around the streets. Unfortunately, we still have such a very bad pandemic over here that we're pretty much locked down, especially in Washington, D.C. And of course, Washington and where I live here in Northern Virginia was very much supported the election of President Biden. So I think you've had a lot of relief politically on that side. But there's a lot of tension right now concerning the disputes that President Trump has been raising about the validity of the election, and that is causing a lot of concern, I think unnecessary concern. So we're kind of looking forward to both the vaccine and also to the inauguration.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Thank you very much again for joining us. We will discuss, of course, the topics that you're actually mentioning during the panel discussions. But first, I will finalize introducing the panel by introducing Raymond Mens. Raymond Mens is joining us, I think, live from Haarlem. We know each other for almost a decade. We started campaigning, I think, 10 years ago when the VVD became the biggest party for the first time in history in the Netherlands. Until the time, you were just an ordinary guy from around the street, around the block. You're now actually a famous person in the Netherlands, isn't it?
Well, time flies when you're having fun. So you're right. It was exactly 10 years ago. I'm not quite famous yet, but I'm having a lot of fun. It's been great fun. I mean, I've been following American politics now for 20 years. So over the last year, I thought, how about putting pen to paper and just describing some of the trends behind Trump that I see? That's what I've done. And luckily, it's been picked up quite extensively in Dutch media, to which I'm very grateful, of course.
Yeah, because you were actually on television like every evening ahead of the US elections. Yeah. Actually, my first teasing question for you would be, your book is called Long Live Trump, but then he lost the elections. So what happened, Raymond?
Well, actually, as I try to explain it to everybody, and I think I will do so today as well, that the book is about what if Trump loses. And in the book, I say it doesn't matter if he loses this election or if he actually wins and he will stay on for 4 more years. But my point is the trends behind Trump, and I'm sure we'll talk about them today, they will last. So no matter if Trump will stay or not, the trends behind him will stay. So that's why the title is Long Live Trump. So I always said it would be a close election because of the Electoral College. I thought he could win. But regardless, whether he would lose or win now, eventually he will leave. And eventually he will leave. And the trends behind him will stay. So long live Trump, I'll stand by that.
Very good. So we can still buy your book for Christmas, isn't it? Thank you so much for joining
Absolutely.
us.
Highly recommended.
We will discuss the topics later during the panel discussion. But first, I can introduce to you the fourth person of our panel, someone I know pretty good as well. It is Roelien Kamminga. She is joining us live, I hope, from Groningen, isn't it? Or is it The Hague? Where are you, Roelien?
I'm in The Hague at the moment,
in The Hague.
Lennart.
But you're going to move to Groningen, isn't it?
Yes, of course. Back to my roots.
Exactly, because just like Piet Hoekstra actually and you have your roots as well in Groningen, one of the most beautiful provinces of this amazing country where we live in. We know each other for quite some time. We traveled around the globe. We've been to Bosnia to defend our liberal values together with our friends from the Balkan, with NHS and NASA Stranka. We went to London to the Liberal International Congress, but then you were just an ordinary civil servant, and now you make a big transformation into a politician. You are now a candidate for the national elections, and actually one of our top candidates for the national elections, for the upcoming elections in March, because then we have to defend the fact that we are the biggest party of the Netherlands again. So how's your campaign going so far, despite all the COVID measures?
Well, thanks for the introduction, and it brings back very good memories, Lennart, which you described from Bosnia and also London. But yeah, the campaign is just starting, so I'm very excited and, of course, honored to have been, got this position on the candidate list. Well, my campaign, I think it's going to be different from the last campaign I did for the European Parliament with COVID, but still, I think things like this will show that there's still a lot to do, and we can go campaigning, debating, and meeting people. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Thank you very much for joining us. And we're happy to see your connection between what's going on in Groningen, what's going on around the globe, and what's going on in The Hague. So thank you very much for joining. We are now slowly going, after the introductions, of course, to the topics that we really like to discuss, which I'm going to introduce shortly. And I keep repeating, you can join us by posing your questions online. Four years of Trump. That is the major topic of what we're going to discuss today, but also the future. When Trump was elected as president of the United States 4 years ago, it was a shock to many people, I think especially in Europe, that he won the elections. What we're going to discuss in the first block is whether his policies were a big success or not. And we're going to focus on the domestic policies. So was 4 years of Trump a success or not?
Late today, President Trump said the U.S. troops being pulled out of Syria will remain in the Middle East to prevent an ISIS resurgence.
President Trump has just 9 weeks left in his term. During that time, he's expected to sharply cut U.S. troop strength in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Overseas now to Jerusalem, where the new U.S. Embassy is opening this morning on Israel's 70th anniversary. Ivanka Trump and her husband, Jared Kushner, are there as protests erupt at the border.
We must hold accountable the nation which unleashed this plague onto the world, China. In the earliest days of the virus, China locked down travel domestically while allowing flights to leave China and infect the world.
So we're now going to discuss the issues of the presidency of President Trump. Was his policy a success or not? And in this block, we will focus slightly more on his domestic policies. And I'll do that in duo, so I'll start with two amazing speakers. So please join us, Pete and Stephen, for the first round of talks about the presidency of Donald Trump. And maybe it is just kind to start with the ambassador who served the president of the United States, Trump, to introduce to us whether the policies of Donald Trump were a success or not. And I guess your answer would be, yes, it is a success, but could you tell us why?
Well, I mean, if you're looking domestically, clearly for much of the president's term, we had a very, very strong economy benefiting all Americans across the board. Highest employment rates for minorities, increasing wages, and these types of things. So a very strong economy. He also did criminal justice reform. I was in Congress. I left in 2011. This was something that Republicans and Democrats had been trying to do for years because they believed there was a built-in bias against minorities and those types of things. And this is the president that actually got that done. He reformed the tax code, cutting taxes. So on a domestic front, it was very good. Internationally, what the American people wanted domestically is exactly what he delivered. He did not get us into any new wars, has phased us out of different wars, and he went to our allies and reaffirmed our commitment to NATO, but said we need a strong NATO, and you've heard me say it over and over in the Netherlands, we need a strong NATO where everybody picks up their fair share. And we've made progress in that with many countries in Europe. Disappointingly, the Netherlands is not one of those countries where we made significant progress. But in lots of other places in Europe, countries have decided to step up their defense spending and develop the capabilities that are necessary to provide the safety and security that we believe we need in Europe.
Thank you. We will just focus on his international policies in the second block, but you also mentioned like he is. It was a big success in the criminal code and when it comes to tax reforms. Mr. Szabo, how would you characterize the 4 years of Trump? Was it successful or not? And would you agree on Mrs. Hoekstra's statements on his successes?
Well, I'm more of a foreign policy person, so I'm not a specialist on domestic policy. I would say the most negative legacy is the polarization of the country, that the president, unlike all previous presidents, did not really try to unite the country, the so-called red states and blue states, but really just sort of emphasized his base and polarization. And I think that is his legacy, and it's something that we're going to have a long time to deal with and trying to overcome. He didn't create it, of course, but I think he made it a lot worse. I think the other issue, of course, is the pandemic and the mishandling of the pandemic. Now, Europe has also had these problems. I'm not saying there's some kind of secret magic response to this, but the fact that he did not really use the federal authority the way that he should have, the way that, say, for example, Chancellor Merkel did in another federal system in Germany. I think that's probably the main reason he lost the election, was that he was not seen as really being able to manage the pandemic. So those would be two quick comments.
You're obviously more critical on his policies. If there would be one thing that you would mention, like, well, maybe that was actually also a success with Trump, would there be anything that you could mention?
Domestically?
Yeah.
Well, I think I agree with the ambassador. I think certainly the economy took off under him. I'm not a big fan of the tax cuts because I think they were too much benefiting the rich, and I think we missed the chance to develop infrastructure and use the money to develop infrastructure, which is a major problem for us. So I think that even though the economy has taken off, we still have this long-going problem, which started before Trump, of inequality and of people falling behind, and really of the negative effects of globalization.
Yeah. Mr. Hoekstra, would you agree on any kind of the criticism that there is on Trump? Is there any mistake that you would mention Mr. Trump made in his presidency?
Well, mentioned the infrastructure. This was something the president highlighted early on in his presidency, believing that doing $1 trillion infrastructure package was something that he was hoping that we could do with the Democrats. Obviously, that never did come to fruition. And I appreciate the comments on the COVID pandemic. I wouldn't agree with them in that, America is now administering a vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine. I think later on today, the FDA will approve the second vaccine, Moderna. This is unprecedented that in a period of 8 to 9 months, you go from identifying a pandemic to actually having a vaccine available. And hopefully by this summer, hundreds of millions of people around the world will have received this, and that will facilitate a change back towards normalcy.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your opening statements. You will join us later again in the panel discussion where we have the questions of our viewers from Instagram, Facebook and Twitter. But I will first ask our other panel members, Raymond and Roelien, to join me on this topic of the domestic policies in the 4 years of Trump. I can see that Roelien and Raymond are both on the screen. You can hear me. Your microphones are unmuted. Yep. Good. Everything is working. Maybe actually to start with Raymond, is there actually such a big difference between the policies of Obama and Trump? Was it such a big major change as we all believe it was, or was it just actually a slight difference? Or was it just more the way he presented himself?
Well, it depends on which front you look. It's my judgment that internationally, but we'll talk about that, I'm sure, later, there's not that big of a difference. America, over the past 10 to even 20 years, has looked at the world more like, okay, we accept the world as it is, and if we make investments, we want a return on those investments. And Trump, the businessman as he is, accelerated that, but there's not that big of a difference, and I expect Joe Biden will also not make that big of a difference. When it comes to domestic policy, there is a big difference, I think, and I think the ambassador stated it correctly in the sense that there was lots of deregulations. But also I think that we sometimes, I mean, I'm a political scientist myself, we sometimes focus on the distinction between domestic and international policy, whereas let's say you are a worker in Ohio and you make stuff with your hands. Yeah, it might be international policy if you renegotiate a trade deal, but the trade deals that Trump renegotiated actually benefit that guy specifically because there will be much more products made in the US. So what we sometimes distinguish as domestic or international policy, for a lot of people that voted for Trump, it is a policy that hits home for them.
I see. Thank you very much. Roelien, you are now a politician, we can ask you now for your opinion. You're no longer a civil servant. If you would be able to vote in the US elections previously in November, would you have voted for Biden or for Trump?
I think I would have voted for Biden, I must say. And that's mainly because, I mean, I did studied international relations. And I know if you look at Trump's administration and the policy, and especially his foreign policy, it's more unilaterally based. So I think for that reason, I would have voted Biden because I'm hoping, and especially from I started my career at the Foreign Affairs, the Dutch Foreign Affairs, and the first dossier I got was the Iranian nuclear program. So you will understand that I am especially hoping that Biden will return back to the Iranian nuclear deal and the agreements there.
We will discuss it in the next block when we discuss the international affairs of Trump. But actually also to Roelien, are there any positive signs that, like, of course you're defending Biden's policies and you're politically closer to Biden than to Trump, but what would you see as the biggest advances of the presidency of Trump?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that Trump gave a voice to a lot of people who weren't heard before that. I think we see that also in the Netherlands. I mean, there's a big group who don't feel represented, and I think Trump gave them a voice. That's important because they have, and as I said, we also see that in the Netherlands, in the European Union, they have valid concerns, and I think we have to take that seriously, and Trump did that. So I think that's good. And also a side effect, I think, from Trump's policy for America First was that we, as the Netherlands, but also in Europe, had to get more self-aware. I think, from my view, for my taste, we got a bit too dependent on the US being there. So I think it made us more creative and more self-aware.
Thank you very much. I think we're now going to the panel discussion where we will see all four of you. So please, Pete and Stephen, join us again. And I think on the screen, then we see four faces. I ask all panel members to unmute the microphones, and then we have some questions here coming from the audience. I see that the first question is actually for Raymond. According to you, has Trump successfully finished his America First mission? Is the question for Raymond.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he did. And I said also that I don't think it is specific to Trump. I think it is a development you've seen for a much longer period of time. But the businessman as he is, he did give a new voice to that, and he framed it as America First, but it's something we've seen for much longer. But basically what he said was, I accept the world as it is. I don't have a dreamy vision of how the world should be. I accept it as it is. And I'm also willing to engage in it, but I also want money for it. I want a return on investment, and I call it the dollar doctrine. That's basically his doctrine for the world. And also with America First, it has now taken fully hold in the Republican Party, because there's a lot of people coming into the Republican Party who are actually attracted to not only the way Trump has behaved in politics, but also specifically to this America First doctrine. So I think he succeeded in both making sure it happens internationally, but also in inspiring other politicians within the Republican Party to embrace it. So I think it is a success, yes.
I think you would agree, Mr. Ambassador, don't you? Or was
well, the president accomplished everything he wanted to accomplish with America First? And the answer is clearly no. I mean, that's why he campaigned so passionately for a second term. He laid the foundation for it, but clearly we have not, I find it interesting that from a VVD politician, they find an administration that previously said we're going to pivot to Asia as being the best, perhaps, campaign and the best candidate for Europe and for the Netherlands. I mean, Trump refocused our policy on Europe. And the big thing that he has not yet accomplished, we haven't gotten to where we want to get to on NATO, but more importantly, he wanted more trade, more open trade between Europe and the United States to make us a bigger economic juggernaut so that we can confront the economic challenge coming from China. That is where we have to face. I don't know where VVD is on that, but that is the vision that our president had, and that was the thing that we did not get. We did not get a new trade agreement with Europe that opened our markets and allowed us to benefit even more reciprocally from our economic strengths.
Obviously, his policy isn't finished yet. That's why he was campaigning for 4 more years. But as Raymond stated, of course, the Republican Party did change because of Donald Trump. Actually, a question that we have for Mr. Szabo, and is also, I think, a linking bridge between this topic and the next topic that most of you would like to discuss, which is international policy, as I see that many are already touching it. Maybe to start as a brief introduction, and then we'll get to the topic, is to what extent is the China policy of Trump, was that a domestic policy or was it a through international policy? Or was it something that he somehow, was it for domestic purposes that he did it?
No, I think there's a consensus, a bipartisan consensus here in this country that China is now our major challenge and it's a major adversary. And it's not just because of Trump or the U.S., it's also because of Xi and the way that what Xi has been doing in China, making it a more authoritarian and nationalist system. I think that where I would differ with Trump on this, of course, Obama already started this with the so-called Pacific pivot, is that I think that Biden will understand that we need Europe as a partner on dealing with China, because the challenge of China is so different than the Soviet challenge. The Soviet challenge is primarily military. Yeah. The Chinese challenge is very different. It's cultural, it's economic, they're a much bigger player, and we need the Europeans. And I fault the current president, on not really reaching out and develop. I know that there were some attempts to do this, but I think they could have done a much better job of creating a partnership with Europe. And I think we will do this in the next administration. I would just say, finally, I think the Republican Party is on board with this. I think Trump was an outlier when it came to this. Most Republicans understand the need for Europe and for partnership in Europe and for NATO. So I really think that even if we have another Republican administration, if it's not Trump, you're not going to see this return to this kind of policy on Europe.
Thank you. And Roelien, I think the question. Oh, sorry, there's a reaction coming. Maybe a short reaction from Mr. Hoekstra, the ambassador.
Yeah, no, I mean I'm trying to understand what you saw as the Trump policy towards Europe. The assignment was clear to all of us as European ambassadors. We need we need Europe as our closest partner. Europe with the UK is 540 million people. We're 340. That gives us around 900 million people. If we are going to confront China on the issues of human rights, on intellectual property, on access to markets, and all of these types of things, the message from the Trump administration was very, very clear. We need to do this with Europe. We can't do it alone. Europe can't do it alone. The only way we're going to bring about change is to cooperate and coordinate with Europe. That was the message of the Trump campaign and the Trump presidency. Yep.
Maybe a short, because this is also what we will discuss in the next round of talks, where I will interview you all individually on this topic on the foreign affairs. But maybe we'll give Roelien the short opportunity to react on actually the question of Mr. Hoekstra. Where is the VVD when it comes to the policies of China and the trade? And to what extent do we need the United States to cooperate there?
I think the United States is a really important partner in that. I mean, also for our trade, we're a trade nation, so we depend on all economies, but especially we have a lot of trade with the US. So, I mean, I think we're dependent on each other for that, and especially to have a good deal who facilitates also the trade agreements that we have. If I look to China, I agree with the ambassador that we have to, and also with Mr. Szabo, actually, that it is a different kind of challenge that we have with Russia.
Yeah.
So I do see it's more economical digitally, and so we need to change our normal tactics for that, I think, because Russia was more military, as Mr. Szabo also said.
Thank you very much. I think it's a small bridge already to the next round, because then we'll interview you all individually. So please let me briefly introduce you to the next topic. Thank you very much. It has been discussed actually in the previous block already. The US foreign policy. To many in Europe, it was a big shock that Trump won, and many would characterize his policies by one of his first statements, America first. When President-elect Joe Biden was elected, one of his first tweets was to the world leaders, my message is the United States will be back on the world stage. What we will discuss in the next block is, will Biden have a very different policy of Trump when it comes to foreign affairs? Please join me.
Congratulations. America first. From day one, Donald Trump vowed to take a tougher line with US enemies, a stance reflected in some caustic Twitter exchanges with North Korea's leader. But in a move that stunned the world, the bellicose rhetoric soon gave way to an historic rapprochement. Over the course of his presidency, Trump has met Kim Jong-un 3 times. That's an accelerated diplomatic drive that Joe Biden would be unlikely to continue. In contrast, under Trump, US relations with China have hit their lowest level in decades, primarily amid a trade dispute. But Trump's blaming of China for America's coronavirus woes has heightened tensions, and trade talks are now frozen. But it's perhaps over Russia that the two men differ most strongly. Trump has seemed reluctant to criticize President Putin at times, even when US intelligence concluded the Kremlin had interfered in the 2016 election.
The fact is that I've gone head-to-head with Putin and made it clear to him we're not going to take any of his stuff. He's Putin's puppy.
But Biden appears unlikely to reverse one of the signature foreign policy developments of the Trump presidency, the transfer of Washington's Israel embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
Welcome back to this VVD International webcast. In this block of discussion, we will discuss the international relations of the United States around the globe, but especially also with Europe, of course, and how we can cooperate. So please join me in this panel discussion, first in individual discussion. I will interview all panel members first individually on what they believe should be the next priorities on the US foreign affairs, and also how we characterize the 4 years of Trump when it comes to foreign affairs. And the first one to join me is the fresh politician from the Netherlands. It is Roelien Kamminga. You can vote for her, number 14 on the list if you live in the Netherlands, and otherwise make sure you invite her if you don't live in the Netherlands. Roelien, welcome back, and thank you again for joining us. In the previous round of talks, you had a discussion, of course, with Mr. Hoekstra, and actually said that the United States and Europe need each other in when it comes to foreign affairs. Do you believe that under Trump that worked out pretty well? Was there a good cooperation between both countries and between Europe and the United States?
I think for some instances, I think there were. I think a lot of previous speakers have said that some things didn't change really. I mean, of course, he was more oriented on the domestic politics, but still a lot of things continued just as we were used to. I think I see it as an advantage, as I said before, that we were made more self-aware. I think Trump has, if you can give him anything, you can give him that he is very clear and he has a more business-like mentality. And I think that for Dutchmen, we can, we understand that. I think we also businessmen by nature. So I think that was really good. What you saw is that his stance on NATO, his stance on, as I said, multilateral agreements like Iran, I think there we had... I think there we can make a new step with, hopefully, the next administration.
And maybe a short answer to the question, was Donald Trump right to push the Netherlands and Europe to invest more into NATO?
For me personally, yeah, I think he's right, yeah.
Thank you very much. You will join us later on this topic when we have our panel discussion with the four of you again. But first I will go to Raymond, live from Haarlem, which is in the United States called Harlem, and a very different...
The Dutch Harlem.
Sorry? The Dutch Harlem, indeed, which is very different from the New York Harlem. It's a very uptown city where people are happy to live in the Netherlands. Thank you very much for joining. Maybe the question for you as an US expert would be, is actually the US foreign policy under Trump so different from what Obama did?
No, I think it's an acceleration of what Obama did, but it's not any different. I mean, remember that at least with Trump, we had a clear vision, which is we're going to put America first. And here is what it means. And I think wider politically, and this also is relevant for the Netherlands, is that a lot of voters don't think in this traditional left or right divide anymore. They look at the politician and they think, who are you? And what are you going to do for me? Or what are you going to do for us? And at least with Trump, we had a clear vision. And I'm still trying to find the democratic vision. So without putting a point on it, whether I think his vision is good or bad, at least he has one. Whereas Obama's foreign policy has most often been described as don't do stupid stuff, meaning how can we stay out of as many conflicts in the world as we can. Whereas Trump proactively said, I don't want to get involved. If you want me to be involved, I'm happy to. But here's my bank account number because I want some money for it.
Yeah. So also actually it was kind of acceleration. Also Obama pushed for the national interest, maybe gave it a different name, not America First. But many of the policies have been continued. And later we will discuss, maybe even Biden will continue them. We will do that in a panel discussion. But first I will go to our next speaker in the panel, which is Szabo, live from the United States still. I hope we still have a good connection with Washington, D.C., which is the case, as I can see here. Mr. Szabo, in the first round of talks, you have shown that you have some fierce criticism of what Mr. Trump did as president of the United States, especially when it comes to his foreign policy. So maybe my question to you would be, what is the biggest mistake that Trump made, and what would be the first thing for Joe Biden to do as president-elect of the United States to restore that on the world stage?
Yes, well, first of all, I think this title of this slogan, America First, is ridiculous. I mean, I've never seen an American president that said America Second. You know, it's always been America First. It's really how you define it. And I think what we've seen, my criticism of Trump would be that America First has meant America alone, that we have lost the wonderful sort of social capital that we have built up with strong alliances both in East Asia and in Europe. And his attack on not only on NATO, and I would say he did attack NATO because he linked defense spending to the Article 5 guarantees, which is something that nobody has done, even though we've always been concerned about burden sharing. We never linked it directly to Article 5. And also, I think attacking the EU and making the EU an enemy goes against the tradition of most American presidents that we look at United Europe as in the American interest. So I think he's been a disaster when it comes to foreign policy, even though I think there's some continuity. We can get back into that. I do think there's going to be continuity on things like China, on ending endless wars, on getting out of the Middle East. I think those things are going to continue.
Very clear. And maybe just like in one or two sentences, what is the first task of Joe Biden to restore that? What is in your vision clearly a mistake of what President Trump did?
Well, I think what you'll see, he's going to come to Europe immediately. I think he's going to come to Brussels, and I hope he goes to some European capitals, and he's going to make the case that we understand that, he says America is back, but it's not the same America. America is not the powerful America it was 20, 30 years ago. We need allies a lot more than we did then. But I think that's what he'll do. He'll go to Europe and he'll go to Brussels and say the EU is our partner. It's not our enemy.
Thank you very much. We will ask you to join again in the panel discussion in a few moments. But first, I will ask Pete Hoekstra on his reaction. Maybe actually it was stated pretty. Yeah, we're live. We have a live connection with The Hague again. Actually, Mr. Szabo said it was not America first, it was America alone, while Roelien Kamminga stated, as the VVD stands, the United States and the Netherlands and Europe, of course, need each other. Would you reflect on the comments that it was not America first, but America alone? Do you agree?
No, not at all. The president, historically, this administration, they were mocked for almost 3 years, maybe a little bit more than 3 years, about the ongoing efforts to try to resolve and get through a breakthrough in the Middle East. They got it. 4 Arab countries recognizing the right of Israel to exist. You don't do that alone. You do that with a lot of partners and a lot of negotiations, a historic capability. President never he challenged NATO, and yes, the Dutch and others were offended. Wow, we actually have to pay for our fair share of national security, and it's like, yeah, you do. And so, and at one occasion, maybe people inferred that he was challenging Article 5, but he made it very, very clear, and American policymakers very clear, that we would not, and we had not backed away from Article 5. In regards to the EU, the president said, what we want is that relationship to grow. We want it to grow economically, and the best way to do it is to level the playing field. And the best way to level the playing field is to go to zero tariffs on products going from the U.S. to the EU, and vice versa. We weren't able to get there.
Very clear. Thank you very much. We will now ask everyone of the panel to join us again. Thank you very much for your reflection on the comments that have been made by the other speakers. We have now all 4 panel members back in my screen. I think everyone sees each other. Thank you very much again for joining us. I tried to have some of the questions here that have been asked by the people who are joining us, and many actually are about the China policies. Maybe that's a question to start with Mr. Szabo, actually, would be an interesting question. It is posted here towards Roelien, but we already discussed it. But the question is, will Biden continue the China policy of Trump, or is he going to radically change the policy towards China?
As I say, I think there's a real bipartisan consensus that we have to deal with China as a major adversary. And I think that the only difference will be, as I mentioned, I think going back to the need for the Europeans, in respect to what the ambassador said, the fact is you don't start a trade war with both China and Europe at the same time, and you need to pull the Europeans in. So I would have gone after the Chinese and tried to work something out, with the Europeans and not antagonizing them as well. So I do think that there will be a continuation on China policy. I think China is going to be one area. There's a number of areas I think that where there's to be continuity. This is one I think that's going to be very important, and I think it's going to be it's going to take. I do give the Trump administration credit for things like Huawei and the 5G and pushing the Europeans on that to make them more aware of it. I think that's been useful, but there are other ways you can do it as well. But I do think I think China will be a strategic glue between Europe and the United States in the next 20 years.
Yeah, Roelien, would you hope actually Joe Biden to continue the policy of Trump when it comes to China? Do you think it's a good idea?
I think so, because I think he also recognized, together with Europe and also the Netherlands, the importance of I think the 5G, for example, to say, okay, well, China is building up a strategic alliance with all kinds of countries around the world, and they are creating a sort of dependence. I think partners with the US to make sure that we are not dependent on only technical materials from China. And it also goes for major internet corporations like Alibaba and things like that. Yeah.
So we can cooperate there with Joe Biden. I actually do agree that there is some foreign policy of Donald Trump that we all benefited from in this panel. Maybe another topic that is one of the questions here as well is actually on what happened in the Middle East. It was mentioned, of course, by Roelien. He blew up the Iran deal. It was also mentioned by Mr. Szabo. But he also created a kind of peace deal between some Arab countries and Israel that never happened before. My question actually is, would you characterize that as a success? Like there is now an Israel-Arab connection that was not there before? Or is it an extra polarization of what's going on in the Middle East? And I'm going to ask the question to Raymond and Hoekstra. And I'll start with Raymond.
Well, I can be very brief. I think it's hard not to describe it as a success. I mean, anyone trying to get a deal done in the Middle East, and then also this particular deal, I think that it is very successful. And also it's a typical Trump way, because a lot of investment was involved. So a short answer, yes.
Thank you very much for the short answer. Mr. Ambassador, what will be your reflection on it? Is it the success of Trump, or did he polarize more in the Middle East than we had before?
I mean, the Middle East has been polarized for as long as I've been involved in politics. I've watched a number of presidents try to break the logjam of what was going on in the Middle East, with Clinton, with Obama, with Bush. And they all worked very, very hard, and they had the best interest of the Middle East and the United States at heart, and they made no progress. This was a fundamentally different approach that I think provides the opportunity for a breakthrough. We've got 4 countries right now. It will be interesting to see whether the president can, and some Middle East countries will announce 1 or 2 more countries recognizing Israel before he leaves on January 20.
Thank you very much. Maybe as a conclusion of this discussion is actually that there is a lot of criticism on the America First policy in international affairs, but there's some consensus that their progress has been made towards China to some extent, but also in the Middle East. Thank you very much for this block. I will now wrap up this discussion, and then we go to the next block, which is transatlantic relations, and so the EU and US under Biden, but also under Trump. Thank you. America first, it was the policy on international affairs, and to many in Europe it was a shock when he was elected. Is Trump putting Europe down on the list of priorities when it comes to NATO or other priorities? Many in Europe felt, of course, maybe excited or happy that Biden would win the elections, because maybe they hope that it is likely that under Biden, Europe will be higher on the list. But will that be the case? That's what we're going to discuss in the next block.
I look forward to driving this global agenda together with the next President of the United States, Joe Biden.
3 hours from the border inside the Irish Republic, the town of Ballina is, like its famously salmon-rich waters, swollen with pride. A distant son of Ballina, Joe Biden has ascended to the height of power. The president-elect knows the town well. His great-great-great-grandfather was born here, and he's promised to return after his inauguration.
Thanks again for joining us in this VVD International webcast at the end of the year, where we discussed the policies of 2020 and what changed in the world. We discussed already the Trump administration, what it did to the domestic policies, but also internationally. In the last round of talks, we will focus on what's going on in the US-EU relations. And therefore, I will ask first 2 persons to join me in the conversation, which is Szabo, an expert on the topic of transatlantic relations, and Roelien Kamminga, one of our top candidates for the VVD on the national list for the elections in March. Maybe to start actually with Szabo, especially, of course, since you're also an expert on this field, in this field. Many in Europe would expect that under Biden, the EU would be on a higher priority list than, for example, under Trump. Would you believe that is rightly to believe, or is that a kind of mistake that's going on in Europe?
No, I think that's true. That doesn't mean that we're not going to have problems or conflicts, but I do think for sure we're going to have a very sort of more positive view of the EU, and the EU is becoming a more key partner. We are going to have I think we're going to have some real problems more on trade issues and on sort of digital issues than we will on defense issues. So the whole issue of the 2% defense spending, that's always around. But I really think that Biden is going to follow on to some extent with what Trump did in terms of trying to bring jobs back to the U.S., protecting jobs and so on. And there's going to be some discussion about this trade deficit and current accounts deficit with Europe. But that's normal. That's been going on for a long time. And I think that will continue. As I say, I think in terms of defense, Biden will reverse the troop withdrawal from Germany and will recommit to NATO.
Mm-hmm. So you say, obviously, the EU will be higher on the priority list of Biden than it was under Trump. You mentioned a few policies that he will prioritize as well, like bringing back troops to Germany. Is there anything else that is on his priority list? Like, is it trade, or should we still invest more into NATO, or is it a new trade agreement, for example? Is there a specific topic that he will focus on?
By the way, I would also mention that Brexit has also increased the importance of the EU. I think Britain is going to become even less of a partner, a significant partner for the U.S. as a result. I'd say clearly climate is, you can see the appointments that he's making with John Kerry and the whole team on climate change, that climate change is going to be a huge issue for cooperation, I think, with the Europeans. And there's going to be a lot of problems, I think, on the whole issue of digital and the IT companies, digital taxes, privacy issues. There's going to be a lot of discussion, I think, about those issues. So I'm looking more to see, I think, of course, China, as we talked about. I think China and economic trade issues are going to be the key in the relationship. NATO is important. Russia's a problem. We have to deal with Russia's cyber and hybrid warfare. But I think that we are going to be working a lot on these new kind of global issues together.
And do you think that under President Biden and somehow divided Europe with the Brexit and maybe harmed of the COVID crisis, we will manage to form like a democratic Western bloc against the policies of China when it comes to Huawei or the trade barriers?
That's a good question. I would say one point I would make. Biden is unusual in that he's a president who knows a lot about foreign policy before he became president. And he's got a lot of experience. Most American presidents are not really into foreign policy. So I think you're going to have a very experienced team right from the beginning, and you won't have a lot of a learning curve in terms of foreign policy. So, but I think otherwise, no. I think that we always have differences of interest between Europe and the United States, but we can manage those within an alliance kind of framework.
Thank you very much.
And not being antagonists. We're not going to be antagonists.
No. Roelien, you will be a politician shortly when you have been elected. Actually, only 2 months after the inauguration of Biden. If you would have a meeting with Joe Biden in your first month as elected member of parliament, what is on your priority list for the President of the United States?
Well, I think I said some of the multilateral arrangements we've had, and the climate. Mr. Szabo mentioned that the climate agreements, and also I myself mentioned the Iranian nuclear deal. I find important what I think was key, and I think a word that Mr. Szabo mentioned just yet was alliance. And I think the feeling of an alliance and common interest in a common goal, I think that would be on top of my priority list, to do things together, because we need each other.
And are you hopeful that it will be more fruitful cooperation between Biden and the EU than under Trump and the EU?
I think so. I mean, as I said, of course, I see all the things that were mentioned. There were also some negative sides to. I think the relationship was a bit more strained under Trump, but still there were a lot of good initiatives, and I think we cooperated well on the things that mattered, also the previous years. So, but I think it's going to be a bit better, and because of all the things were said already. I mean, NATO, I think it's going to be more a sense of together and make steps together than doing things because we're both in a win-win situation.
Thank you very much. This is a very hopeful message. Maybe a short ending, like a conclusion from Mr. Szabo.
I would just say that I would be concerned about the Eastern Europe and the populist governments, which were very close to Trump. I mean, Poland and Hungary in particular, but also Turkey, Russia. So I think there's going to be some problems there with these East European countries that are with the Biden administration, which is going to be much less tolerant of democratic backsliding than the Trump administration was.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all your comments and the hope that there will be a better cooperation between the EU and the US under Biden. I'm now going to ask Pete and Raymond, the ambassador, and Raymond Mens to join me in the next block of discussions about it and see whether they agree on this, actually. And I will start by asking the ambassador, Pete Hoekstra. There was a lot of hope in the previous conversation between Roelien and Stephen that there will be an improvement in the cooperation between the United States and the EU when Biden has been elected. And there was a kind of priority list from Roelien Kamminga to work on together, of course. Would you agree with that, or do you think that it will be worse under Biden?
Well, I think that, coming into being the ambassador here, one of the things that you recognize is the momentum in the relationship, whether it's economically, from a national security standpoint, or there's so much momentum in the relationship. I think the biggest thing you're going to see is a change in tone. Actually, I agree with Stephen on a number of the points that he made. I think Trump's slogan of America First was probably the most misunderstood term, and totally, Europe was totally focused on it. The Dutch were totally focused on it. Every leader negotiates on behalf of putting their country's interests first. And it was totally mischaracterized here in Europe, and I think misunderstood. The relationship with Europe is fine. There's a difference in tone, but Trump is committed to NATO. We were always committed to the EU and trade and those types of things. We will continue, I think, to work together on China. Stephen is absolutely right. Digital and ITT is going to be a difficult area for us to come to agreement on, but we need to come to agreement on because of the importance of these two sectors in our economy. Where will the major difference be? Yeah, it will be in climate, okay? On January 20, John Kerry will be headed back to Paris, and we will be part of the Paris Climate Accord. That will be the most noticeable difference.
Thank you very much. Raymond, as you said, actually on the foreign policy between Obama and Trump, it was more like the tone of voice that was different, not the content of the policies. Yeah. Would you say the same for the EU-US relations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would definitely, and one of the speakers said that also before, expect Biden to visit Europe soon, as he would himself describe it, America is back. Well, I'm sure they'll be back, and Biden will be very friendly to all his European partners, and he will strike a different tone. But I think we should manage expectations and not expect there to be wild changes. Yes, on climate, absolutely, John Kerry will fight for that, and it will be a major change. But all in all, I think we should, as Europe, look more towards ourselves and accept the reality that the United States will actually move forward on this America First platform. And I agree that that does not mean they do everything alone, but it does mean a more investment-looking way of looking at international relations, and that I think in its core will not change when President Biden gets in office.
Thank you very much for these comments, Raymond. In the Netherlands, we call that nuchter, which is a little bit down to earth. It's not with every elections that the world has been changing so much. It's just there's some continuity in policies as well. Thank you very much for these nuchter comments. We will now go to the panel discussion, and where I invite all of you again. So also Stephen and Roelien to join us again. And actually, I would like to take the opportunity, since it's almost 5 o'clock, and you of course have different appointments or want to start the Christmas weekend, to ask some questions that have been asked by the viewers that are watching and joining us from all over the globe via social media. So they are maybe a little bit off topic, but I will try to ask a question to everyone. So I give the opportunity, of course, to our viewers to join us here. The first question is actually for Stephen Szabo. Do you think that Putin is looking forward on working with Biden? We didn't discuss the topic of Russian relations that much, but is Putin looking forward together with Biden? Mr. Szabo.
That's a very good question. I think to some extent he might be, because I think he's looking for a little bit more stability and predictability. And while you had the president taking positions on Russia, the Congress wasn't backing him up. And so I think to some extent, I mean, Biden's made it clear he's in favor of the extension of the START agreement, and I think you'll have some limited, predictability. On the other hand, I mean, you have a lot of animosity among Democrats toward Russia for a lot of reasons, and especially Biden. So it's not going to be a very pleasant relationship for sure. And I think you'll see a lot more pushback. But you'll see some, areas where we can work together. Certainly climate, certainly on arms control. Maybe even we'll get some kind of agreements on nuclear issues in Europe. I don't know. So I think we'll have a business-like relationship, but it won't be friendly.
Not very warm, just a business-like relationship. Thank you very much. The next question is from Max, and it is a question for Pete. Mr. Hoekstra, will the Republican Party move to Trumpism or get back to the more moderate stance it had before Donald Trump? So did actually Donald Trump change the Republican Party, and is it going to endure? Mr. Hoekstra.
Yeah, I might disagree with the characterization of extreme and those types of things, but clearly Donald Trump will have had a lasting impact on the Republican Party. For how long? I would say for at least the next decade.
Thank you very much. So it changed indeed the Republican Party, but you wouldn't call it a more radical stand of view. And the next question that we have is actually for Raymond, which is again on international issues. The question is NATO strong enough to withstand more NATO skeptical US presidents in the upcoming decade? So what if we would have, like, say, a second Trump? I think is the assumption of the asker of the question. Is NATO strong enough to withstand this? Raymond.
Well, actually, Lennart, I don't know if NATO will be strong enough, but I do think it's wise to prepare for it, because Trump is not the only one who will call for each country, including us, to pay our fair share, as the Americans would say it. And I think, as most of us in this call, in this meeting would describe it. Look, Obama and Bush have said exactly the same thing, only they said it behind closed doors. And one of the refreshing things, at least a lot of voters think so about President Trump, is that he says it also outside of the room. So he goes to the headquarters of NATO and says, hey, who paid for this building? Oh, yeah, that's me. So it will definitely continue, and it's wise for NATO to prepare for it. Whether they're strong enough, I actually cannot say.
Thank you. Cannot say. Maybe a short comment of Szabo on this. That would be interesting since your topic of expertise.
Well, I think, NATO, we're not in NATO as to doing a favor for the Europeans. We're there for our national self-interest. I do think you are going to see a shift toward giving the Europeans more responsibility within NATO. And I would not be surprised to see a shift where in maybe 5 or 10 years, we have a Secretary General who's American and a SACEUR who's European. But I think NATO, and I do think NATO will be less important. I do think the issues we're dealing with are going to be more in these economic issues and also dealing with cyber and hybrid warfare rather than classic defense issues.
Thank you very much. The last question that we have from the audience is actually for Roelien. We focused, of course, on the EU-US relations. After it was America first, we had that famous video that says make it the Netherlands second. So at least that we have like a close connection between the Netherlands and the United States, despite the stance of the president. Actually, the question here is what should be on the list, the priority list of the Dutch US relations. So not really the EU-US relations, but what is the priority for the Netherlands to discuss with the United States?
I think trade is really important, especially since we're coming out of the COVID-19 crisis. I think security issues, related issues, I think we're close partners, have been allies for years and years and years, and the economics. So I think we need to trade and help each other with that. So that would be, I said two, excuse me for that, but still I think they're both that important.
Thank you very much. We're almost at the end of this panel discussion and thereby actually finalizing what we're doing here. So I want to give a short opportunity to give everyone what is the last sentence that you would like to mention that I didn't ask about, but you would feel very unhappy not to share it before Christmas time. I'll start with Roelien and I'll just make the round as I see it here on my screen. Roelien, one last sentence.
Wow, it's a big question. Well, no, I think I'm happy with this, and I think I want to reiterate that we're good partners, the US and the Netherlands.
Thank you very much. Raymond, buy your book?
Well, you all, very briefly, I think there's a lot of worry that a lot of postal services don't get your deliveries there on time. But if you order my book today, you will have it within 2 days. So that's in time for Christmas. Yes, Lennart.
Thank you very much. Great message. Thank you very much. Mr. Szabo.
Well, Christmas is a time for hope and rebirth. And I think we've had a horrible year, and we're going to have a much better year next year. So I'm very hopeful about the future.
Thank you very much. And the last words for the outgoing ambassador of the United States that we hosted here in the Netherlands. And it was a great honor to have you here in the show. What will be your last famous words in this show for the VVD?
Prachtige feestdagen. Does that communicate?
Gelukkig nieuwjaar.
Sorry.
Happy New Year. Thank you very much for joining. Thank you very much for joining us during those VVD International webcasts. It was a great honor and a great pleasure to see you in this unusual way, in this unusual year. It was my hope and my expectation for this year that I would travel a lot to see you all and ask you to come to the Netherlands and that we could learn and share from each other. We do it now in this way, and it was a great pleasure actually to do it in this way. And maybe that is something that we bring to 2021 as well. This new way of cooperation and staying in touch with each other. My message for 2021 would be, I hope definitely that it will be the year where we can meet again as partners from all over the globe, and that we can just discuss those topics not only online as we learned in 2020, but also in real life again back in 2021. Thank you so much for joining. A Happy New Year and Merry Christmas. Thank you very much.